My name is Harper Collins, and I was 34 years old on the day my family turned a celebration into a scene that would follow me across the country. I had flown from Denver to Austin because my younger brother Ethan was graduating from the University of Texas. Everyone in the family treated his milestone as if it were a coronation, and I tried to convince myself that I was there simply to show support. I walked into the grand banquet hall with the soft glow of amber lights shining off crystal glasses and polished floors, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. As always, my parents acted as if the room belonged to them. My father Charles looked smug in his tailored suit, and my mother Miriam floated between tables, greeting relatives as if she had planned the entire ceremony. Ethan stood near the stage, surrounded by friends who adored him. I had barely set my purse on a chair before I heard my mother murmur that tonight would be unforgettable. I should have known she meant it as a threat. For weeks they had hinted about a car, a special gift, an extravagant gesture that would make Ethan feel celebrated. They wanted me to buy a luxury BMW M4 for him, claiming that a successful sister should honor her brother. I said no every time, but they acted as if my refusal were a temporary inconvenience. When my father stepped onto the stage holding a microphone, I felt a strange coldness slip through me. He cleared his throat, smiled at the crowd, and said that tonight he wanted to acknowledge a very generous act. Then he announced that I had decided to buy Ethan a brand new $70,000 BMW as his graduation gift. Applause erupted like a wave, phones lifted in the air. Ethan pressed a hand to his chest in a dramatic display, pretending to be surprised. I felt hundreds of eyes swing toward me. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I stood slowly and said the only words I could manage. I never agreed to that. The applause died instantly. A cousin whispered selfish under her breath. My mother stiffened and looked at me with a glare sharp enough to carve stone. My father froze, then stepped down the stage stairs with a rigid, furious gait. His face had turned a deep shade of red. He stopped a foot away from me and hissed that I had embarrassed him. I repeated my refusal. I said no. The moment stretched thin like glass. Then he struck me across the face with the flat of his hand. Gasps shot through the crowd. Before I could steady myself, his fist came toward my temple. Pain exploded in a bright flash and my legs buckled. I fell sideways, hitting the corner of a table before collapsing onto the floor. I heard people shouting. Someone screamed for help. A glass rolled away and shattered somewhere behind me. Phones were still recording. I could feel warm moisture slipping down my eyebrow, and each breath became more difficult than the last. I tried to lift my head, but the room swayed and my vision fogged. My father stood over me, breathing hard until someone pulled him back. The ceiling lights blurred into long streaks. I heard someone calling emergency services. As consciousness slipped away, I could still sense the frantic shuffle of feet around me. The scent of spilled champagne and overcooked banquet food clung to the air. Someone knelt beside me and kept telling me to stay awake, but the words sounded distant, like they were spoken from behind a wall. I felt hands lifting my head and another voice insisting that I had a pulse, but it was weak. The floor beneath me vibrated when paramedics rushed in with equipment that clattered against the tiles. A bright pinlight flashed across my eyes, and a stranger said that I might have a concussion. They secured my neck, placed me on a stretcher, and wheeled me through a corridor filled with silent onlookers who parted as if I were something fragile and broken. I caught a brief glimpse of my brother standing near the stage with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, as if nothing that happened concerned him. Darkness closed in at the edges of my vision. Everything sounded far away now already. When I look back on my childhood, the memories arrive in quiet, scattered pieces that at first seem harmless until they gather together and form a picture that explains everything that happened later in my life. I was born 3 years before my brother Ethan, and from the moment he arrived, it was clear that the Collins household revolved around him. I was a calm child who preferred books to noise and puzzles to attention. I was the kind of daughter who followed instructions, cleaned up after herself, and tried to make life easier for the people around her. My parents often said that I was low maintenance, but the truth was simpler. I learned early that the less I asked for, the less I risked being ignored or criticized. Ethan, on the other hand, burst into the world with a smile that everyone adored. My father Charles called him a future star before he could even walk. My mother Miriam carried him as if he were made of precious glass and told everyone who would listen that he was special. Relatives brought gifts just for him, even when we both stood in the same room. They would ruffle his hair, pinch his cheeks, and marvel at how charming he was. Then they would turn to me and ask if I was helping my mother enough, or if I was being a good big sister. I grew up watching the difference without having the words to name it. It was most noticeable during birthdays. Mine were quiet evenings at home with a small cake from the local grocery store and a candle that burned quicker than I could make a wish. My parents smiled politely, took a single photo, and hurried to clean up. Ethan's birthdays looked like neighborhood holidays. Balloons tied to the mailbox themed cakes with intricate designs, tables overflowing with food, and entire teams of kids running through the yard with Ethan at the center. I remember one year he turned 8, and my parents hired a magician just because Ethan had mentioned he liked magic. When I turned 11 that same year, my mother placed a simple vanilla cake on the table and said she hoped I did not mind that we had spent extra on Ethan because he was younger and still needed the excitement. I nodded even though my eyes stung because I had already learned that expressing disappointment was pointless. School was no different. When I brought home a certificate for winning the district science fair, I was proud enough to think that maybe my parents would finally see me. My mother took the paper, glanced at it, and told me not to brag. She said it might make Ethan feel inferior because he was not good at science. Later that same week, Ethan played in a soccer game where he missed more goals than he scored, yet. My father rushed down from the bleachers to lift him in the air and call him a champion. I clapped from the sidelines and wondered how many goals I would have needed to score to make my father look at me the way he looked at Ethan. When I was bullied by a girl in 4th grade, I cried in the back seat of the car on the ride home and told my mother what happened. She sighed and said not to make a big deal out of it. She said I had always been too sensitive. But when Ethan came home one afternoon saying a boy teased him about his haircut, my father drove to the boy's house and demanded that the parents discipline their son. Growing up, I believed these differences meant something was wrong with me. Maybe I was not interesting enough or funny enough or worthy enough of the attention that Ethan received so easily. My parents insisted that sons carried the family name and daughters were expected to support the household on a deeper level. I did not understand what that meant at first, but the message became clear with each passing year. Ethan's mistakes were met with patience, while my achievements were met with silence or correction. Ethan once broke a lamp while playing indoors even after being told not to. He cried before my parents could scold him, and instantly he was forgiven. My mother hugged him and said, "Boys will be boys." When I accidentally spilled juice on the carpet during the same week, I was punished and told to be more careful. I apologized repeatedly even though I was only 7 years old. Ethan disagreed with teachers and was congratulated for being bold. I asked questions and was told not to challenge adults. Ethan was encouraged to try new hobbies, join clubs, play sports, and explore interests, even when he quit them after a week. I saved my allowance for months so I could buy a small engineering kit I had seen at a bookstore, and when I showed it to my parents, my father asked why a girl needed to know anything about that kind of work. He said I should focus on being well-rounded instead. Whenever I found excitement in something academic, their response was always the same. They dismissed it as trivial compared to whatever Ethan wanted in that moment. There was a holiday season I remember clearly because it demonstrated everything that had been building for years. Ethan had begged for an expensive gaming console, and my parents said yes without hesitation, even though money was tight that winter. I asked for a small set of model planes that cost a fraction of the console, but my mother told me we needed to be responsible with money. Christmas morning arrived and Ethan unwrapped the console with dramatic excitement. I sat quietly holding a pair of socks my mother said would be useful. Even then, I forced myself to smile because I believed that was what a good daughter did. The financial imbalance grew sharper as we entered our teenage years. When Ethan wanted new cleats for soccer, my father drove him to the sporting goods store and paid without a second thought. When I asked permission to join a robotics club that required a small fee, my mother told me it was unnecessary and a distraction from homework. Relatives praised Ethan as if he were destined for greatness, even though I consistently brought home better grades. They did not see me, not really. They saw the older child who was expected to be dependable, invisible, and endlessly accommodating. The favoritism was not limited to moments of celebration or discipline. It seeped into the quiet spaces of our home, into the way my parents spoke to each other when they thought I was not listening. I remember hearing my father say once that Ethan would carry our family forward, and my mother reply that she hoped I would make a stable living one day so I could help support him. I was 14. That comment sat inside me like a stone. It was the first time I wondered if they saw my life as little more than a support beam for Ethan's dreams. All these memories built the foundation of who I became. I learned to stay quiet. I learned to avoid conflict. I learned to measure my worth through how well I supported others. And that is how the seeds of everything that happened later were planted long before Ethan's graduation, night before the cameras, before the shouting, and before the blow that sent me to the emergency room. My teenage years were supposed to be the chapter of life when a girl begins to understand who she is outside of her parents' expectations, but mine became the years when I realized my value in the Collins household existed only in what I could provide. I got my first part-time job at 16 at a small independent bookstore in Denver, a cozy place that smelled like old paper and warm coffee. I loved the work because it gave me a sense of purpose and independence that I had never felt at home. What I did not expect was how quickly my earnings would be redirected away from my dreams and into Ethan's comfort. The first incident happened only a month after I started working. Ethan needed new clothes for his soccer team, and my father casually remarked that since I had a job, I should contribute to the family. I remember sitting at the dining table staring at the receipt he placed in front of me. My entire paycheck was barely enough to cover the cost of the uniform set. When I hesitated, my father said that helping family was not optional, and my mother added that a good sister would support her brother without complaining. I paid. The next week, my mother asked me to cover half of the cost for Ethan's summer sports camp. She framed it as an opportunity for us to grow closer if I showed him generosity. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I handed over the money because I had been trained for years to believe that my needs mattered less. The first time I ever questioned the fairness of these expectations came late one night when I asked my father why I was always the one paying. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply said that I was capable and Ethan was not. He said that women mature faster and should naturally shoulder more responsibility. My mother chimed in saying that I should think of it as practice for adulthood. I remember sitting alone in my room afterward holding my empty wallet and wondering when exactly I had become an unpaid parent to a boy only 3 years younger than me. As the months passed, Ethan learned that all he had to do was ask. He developed a tone, a soft, manipulative plea that he used whenever he wanted something new. A video game, a pair of limited edition sneakers, tickets to a basketball game. He would come to my doorway, lean against the frame, and say with theatrical sadness that he could not believe our parents were being so strict. Then, a few hours later, my mother would appear and tell me I should help him because she did not want him to feel unloved. I began to notice how family obligations always seemed to point in one direction. When Ethan forgot to pay his phone bill, I was told to cover it because I was older and responsible. When he dented my father's car while learning to drive, I was expected to help pay the repair cost because, according to my father, Ethan was under too much stress to handle the situation alone. But the worst moment came during my junior year. I had saved for months to buy a laptop that I needed for advanced engineering classes. I treated it like a precious artifact, keeping it on a padded sleeve on my desk and never letting anyone touch it. One afternoon while I was at work, Ethan borrowed it without permission to play online games with his friends. He spilled soda on the keyboard, then dropped the laptop while trying to clean it. The screen cracked and the device died with a faint pop. When I came home and saw the shattered machine on the kitchen counter, my stomach collapsed. I asked Ethan what happened, and he shrugged as if breaking something expensive was a minor inconvenience. He even laughed. My parents scolded me for reacting too emotionally. My father said the laptop was fragile and I should have known better than to leave it where Ethan could reach it. My mother said that since I had a job, I could simply buy a new one. Then came the part that still stings. They demanded that I buy a replacement not just for myself, but also for Ethan so that things would be fair. I remember my throat tightening so violently that I could barely breathe. I begged them to reconsider. I told them I needed the money for college applications and textbooks. They remained unmoved. My father lectured me about gratitude and responsibility, and eventually I caved because I did not know how to refuse them. I spent nearly all my savings on 2 laptops and went to bed that night feeling hollow. That was the night something inside me quietly shifted. Not enough to rebel, not enough to confront them, but enough that I began to feel myself detaching from the idea that my family would ever see me as anything other than a resource. I started sleeping with earbuds in just to block out the sound of Ethan bragging on the phone to his friends about the things he got because his sister took care of him. At school, teachers praised my intelligence and my discipline, and I lived in the bizarre contradiction of being valued by strangers while being diminished at home. My engineering teacher encouraged me to join a statewide competition and even offered to drive me if my parents were busy. When I showed my mother the registration form, she told me I should skip the event because it fell on the same weekend as Ethan's soccer tournament. She said I should not make him feel like my activities mattered more than his. I folded the form and dropped it in the trash that evening while standing alone in the kitchen. That was the pattern that defined my teen years. Ethan's desires were treated as urgent emergencies, and my ambitions were treated as selfish distractions. My parents told people that I was mature while Ethan was spirited, but the truth was simpler. Ethan was rewarded for every desire, and I was punished for every boundary. The emotional toll of those years was subtle at first. I did not cry often. I did not break down. Instead, I went numb the way a person does when pain becomes too familiar to fight. I lost the ability to enjoy buying anything for myself because I carried the constant fear that someone would demand I pay for something else. I became automatic in my compliance. When my mother asked for money, I handed it over before thinking. When my father insisted on family loyalty, I kept quiet even when my chest burned with resentment. But the resentment simmered and grew and matured with me. By the time I reached the end of high school, I felt like I had aged decades. I often stood in the mirror brushing my hair while telling myself that college would be different, that I would build a life where my work mattered more than my willingness to sacrifice. Yet even as I dreamed of leaving the Collins household behind, I knew deep down that the patterns of those years would follow me. The roles had been carved too deeply. I was the provider. Ethan was the one who received, and my parents had no intention of changing that even as I prepared to step into adulthood. It would take many more years and a moment of violence caught on hundreds of cameras for me to finally understand that the emotional exploitation of my teenage years had not ended when I left home. It had simply evolved. College became the doorway I had dreamed of walking through since childhood, and when I was accepted into the Aerospace Structural Engineering program at the University of Colorado Boulder, I felt something open inside me that had been locked away for years. I arrived on campus with 2 suitcases, a used backpack, and a hunger to prove that the version of me my parents dismissed was only a small shadow of who I could become. Boulder felt like a different planet compared to our house in Denver. The mountains stood tall and quiet, the air smelled clean, and for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who cared about equations, materials, science, and flight mechanics as much as I did. I poured myself into my studies with the intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime being told her passions were meaningless. While other students balanced social lives and dating, I lived between the lab, the library, and my tiny off-campus apartment. I soldered components until my fingers stiffened, studied load distribution until my eyes blurred, and attended every extra seminar I could find, even if it meant skipping sleep. My professors noticed. They pulled me aside to ask where I had learned such discipline and resilience. I never knew how to answer without telling them that I had been trained by years of being overlooked. In my sophomore year, I joined a research group working on lightweight drone frame optimization. My role was small at first, mostly calculations and simulations, but I treated every task like an audition for something bigger. When a senior student dropped out unexpectedly, my professor handed me the responsibility for structural modeling and asked if I felt ready. I said yes without hesitation. The following months were some of the hardest of my life, but also the most fulfilling. I watched as my designs reduced frame weight by several percentage points, enough to catch the attention of a defense contractor that was quietly funding the project. Seeing my name in a technical paper for the first time made me feel like everything I had endured as a kid had finally pushed me towards something worthwhile. During those years, something else happened too. I began to recognize how abnormal my home life had been. In group projects, when someone made a mistake, no one screamed. No one belittled them. People discussed solutions like equals. Friends celebrated each other's successes instead of competing. For the first time, I felt seen. But every time I returned to Denver for holidays, the contrast hit me like a slap. My achievements meant nothing in the Collins household. When I told my parents that our drone design had been selected for a military trial program, my father barely looked up from the television. He asked if my work meant I was finally earning enough to help more with family expenses. My mother said she hoped I was not becoming too career-focused because men did not like women who were consumed by work. Ethan, on the other hand, had just joined a recreational soccer league, and they talked about it all evening as if he were preparing for the national team. I sat there quietly eating dinner and wondered how many groundbreaking engineering accomplishments it would take for them to look at me with even a fraction of the pride they reserved for Ethan's smallest achievements. After graduation, I received a job offer from Skyreach Systems, a Denver-based aerospace firm that specialized in structural design for military and commercial drones. The salary was more money than I had ever seen. When I told my parents, I expected at least a flicker of excitement. Instead, my father nodded and said it was about time I got a real job. My mother asked if I would be able to help Ethan with his student loans, even though he had barely finished community college and changed majors 4 times. Still, I accepted the job and threw myself into it with the same determination I had poured into college. The work was demanding, requiring long hours, intense design cycles, and constant reviews from senior engineers who had been in the field for decades. Yet, I thrived. I stayed late nearly every night and often arrived before sunrise. My ideas began making their way into prototypes. My supervisor started inviting me to meetings where I was the youngest engineer in the room. A year later, I was put in charge of a small team developing a structural lattice design that would eventually secure a multi-million-dollar contract with the Department of Defense. But back home, nothing changed. When the company celebrated the contract win, the local newspaper submitted a request to interview the lead engineers. I told my parents that an article might be published about me. My father replied that newspapers always exaggerated and that everyone in engineering did the same work. My mother asked if Ethan might be mentioned because he had recently been promoted to shift supervisor at a gym. I tried not to let the comments bother me, but the truth was, they did. Every achievement I earned bounced off them like a rock thrown at a steel wall. Meanwhile, Ethan continued floating through life without consequence. He changed jobs again, posted pictures of himself partying every weekend, and still somehow managed to be the center of every family conversation. My parents called me regularly but rarely to ask how I was doing. They called when Ethan needed money for a new car battery. They called when Ethan wanted to take a trip to Las Vegas and needed extra spending cash. They called when Ethan overdrafted his account again. Every time I said no, they reacted with disappointment or anger. My mother said I was forgetting the importance of family. My father said I was becoming cold from work. Sometimes I hung up the phone and cried from frustration because I could not understand how they could ignore everything I was accomplishing. I began to dread holidays. At Thanksgiving, relatives congratulated Ethan for small achievements while ignoring my promotions entirely. When I shared an update about a project I was working on, someone asked if I planned to settle down soon because career women often regretted their choices. I never said anything out loud, but every time I returned to my apartment after visiting my family, I felt like I was peeling off a heavy layer of shame. At work, I was Harper the structural engineer respected and trusted. At home, I was Harper the backup generator supporting Ethan's life. Years passed and my reputation in the company grew. I earned bonuses, awards, and eventually a leadership position overseeing design teams. I started speaking at conferences and mentoring younger female engineers who reminded me of the girl I had been at 16, working to earn her own laptop. The more I succeeded, the more painfully obvious it became that my family had no intention of acknowledging my progress. Their calls always returned to money. They asked if I could help Ethan with rent, if I could contribute to a family vacation, if I could pay for repairs on their aging SUV. I thought the distance between us would shrink as I grew older, as I accomplished more, as I became someone an ordinary parent would be proud of. Instead, the emotional divide widened. I began to understand that my parents would never see me beyond the role they had assigned me. The provider, the responsible one, the daughter who should feel grateful for the chance to serve. And every unacknowledged achievement became another crack in the foundation of whatever fragile loyalty I still carried. That loyalty would eventually shatter completely, but not until the day I stood in a crowded banquet hall in Texas and said the one word they had trained me to never say: no. The months leading up to Ethan's graduation should have been simple and uneventful, but instead, they unfolded with the slow tightening of a rope around my throat. At Skyreach Systems, I was in the middle of preparing structural documentation for a major government proposal, spending long evenings at my desk surrounded by blueprints and simulation charts while drinking more coffee than any doctor would approve of. Yet, every night when my phone lit up with my mother's name, my stomach sank the same way it had since childhood. The calls started gently enough. She would ask about work in a tone that made it clear she was only waiting to bring up something else. Then her voice would soften into that careful, floating suggestion she used whenever she wanted something from me. Ethan's graduation is coming. It is such a monumental moment for the family. A milestone like this deserves something unforgettable. At first, I did not understand where she was heading. I told her I would fly to Texas for the ceremony and that I was proud of Ethan for finally finishing his degree after switching majors twice. My mother hummed as if she had expected nothing less and then slipped the first seed into place. Your brother has always loved nice cars. A BMW would be perfect for him. I froze where I sat at the kitchen counter, the steam from my mug drifting between us like a wall. I asked what she meant exactly. She laughed as if the answer were obvious and said that since I was doing so well professionally, I could buy Ethan a BMW as a symbolic gesture from a successful older sister. I told her no immediately, firmly, clearly, without hesitation. She barely reacted. She simply replied that we could discuss it again later because graduations were once-in-a-lifetime events. Over the next few weeks, the hints turned into nudges. The nudges became suggestions. The suggestions became expectations. My father joined in with his predictable lecture that family required sacrifice and that Ethan deserved recognition for all his hard work. He ignored the fact that Ethan had never worked as hard as he claimed. My brother had coasted through most of his classes, charming professors when he needed extensions and relying heavily on group projects he barely contributed to. But none of that mattered to my parents. They were determined to build him into a monument, and they needed me to provide the gold plate. What I did not know was that while I was still responding politely or refusing quietly, my parents began telling people that I had already agreed. It started with extended relatives. One evening, I received a text from an aunt in Houston saying she could not believe how generous I was and that buying a BMW showed how deeply I loved my brother. I reread the message twice, completely stunned. Another text followed minutes later from a cousin congratulating me for being the best sister he had ever met. My chest tightened as if someone had dropped a weight on it. I confronted my mother and she brushed it off by saying it was easier to tell people the plan was settled so that everyone would have something to look forward to. I asked her why she had lied. She responded calmly that it was not a lie if I eventually agreed. That was when the dread began to settle like fog inside my ribs. The next escalation came in the form of a mass email my father sent to both sides of the family announcing Ethan's upcoming graduation celebration in Austin. Attached to the bottom of the message was one sentence that made me feel physically ill. Harper has prepared a very special surprise for her brother, a brand new BMW. The announcement was written with such certainty that for a moment I wondered if I had slipped into a reality I did not recognize. I stared at the glowing screen until the edges of my vision blurred. Within an hour, replies poured in. People sending emojis of champagne glasses and party hats. People praising my kindness. People telling Ethan that he was lucky to have a sister like me. I called my father, barely able to control my voice, and demanded that he retract the message. He told me I was overreacting and that disappointing the entire family would be selfish. When I insisted again that I would not buy a car, he hung up on me. That night, I could not sleep. I kept replaying the words they used: selfish, overreacting, family sacrifice. the same script they had used my entire life. But this time, something about it felt bigger and more dangerous. They were building a narrative around me and positioning me as the villain if I refused to play my assigned part. Then Ethan called. His tone was casual, lazy, almost amused. He said he heard I was handling the car and that he preferred a blue BMW. Because it matched his style. I told him no. He laughed softly and said that Mom told him I tend to change my mind at the last minute and that he trusted her more than me. I hung up before I said anything I would regret. For days afterward, I carried an electric tension in my shoulders that even sleep could not erase. I buried myself in work, but every time I opened my phone, there was another message from a relative saying they were excited for Ethan's gift or asking when I planned to bring the car to Austin. I felt cornered. It was a feeling I knew well but had never experienced at this scale. My parents were not simply pushing. They were constructing a public expectation to force my hand. A week before the ceremony, my father called again. His voice was clipped and formal. He told me the graduation reception would include a moment where he would address the guests. He said it in the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. I asked him what he planned to say. He refused to answer and instead reminded me again that family reputation was at stake. My throat tightened. After the call ended, I sat in my living room staring at the wall while the city lights flickered outside my window. That was when the realization hit me like a cold slap. They were planning something public, not a conversation, not a request, a spectacle, a public reveal that would corner me into compliance. I felt sick. I paced the apartment until my legs ached. I considered not going at all. The thought of standing in a crowded hall while the lie they created tightened around me made my chest feel too tight to breathe. But another part of me bristled at the idea of hiding. Why should I disappear to avoid being manipulated? Why should I miss my brother's ceremony because my parents could not respect a boundary? I decided I would go. I decided I would hold my ground. But even as I booked my flight and packed my suitcase, a faint trembling stayed in my hands. The kind of tremor a person feels right before a storm they cannot outrun. The night before I flew out, I barely slept. I lay awake imagining possibilities. Maybe they would make a small announcement. Maybe I could correct them calmly. Maybe no one would react strongly. But deep down, I knew better. My parents never did anything quietly when it came to Ethan. I could already hear the applause. I could see the phones being raised. I could picture Ethan pretending to be shocked. Every version of that scene filled me with dread. When I finally boarded the plane the next morning, my pulse thudded steadily the way it does before something irreversible. I stared out the window at the clouds drifting by and whispered to myself that this time, no matter the pressure, no matter the shame, I would not surrender. I would not let them script my life again. I would say no, even if my voice shook. I just did not know then how violently the moment would explode or how much it would cost me. The morning of Ethan's graduation felt strangely calm, as if the universe were trying to lull me into a false sense of security. I stood in front of the hotel mirror, smoothing the front of my navy dress and telling myself I was imagining things. The prediction of a spectacle still hovered in the back of my mind like a shadow that would not leave, but I tried to bury it beneath layers of rational thought. I had rehearsed what I would say if anything happened. I planned to stay composed. I planned to keep my voice steady. Most of all, I planned to hold my ground no matter how many eyes watched. When I stepped outside, the Texas heat wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. Cars streamed toward the university center and families in bright clothing hurried across the campus lawn carrying bouquets and gift bags. Everything around me looked normal and joyful. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. Inside the main event hall, the air conditioning hummed and the lights above the stage glowed warm gold. Rows of circular tables filled the room, each decorated with white tablecloths, silver centerpieces, and neatly stacked programs. People laughed, cameras flashed, nothing looked sinister. But when I spotted my parents across the room, I felt a familiar tightness coil in my stomach. My mother lifted her chin in a greeting that was more gesture than welcome, and my father gave a curt nod before turning back to a group of guests. Their confidence was unsettling. It was the same quiet certainty they displayed every time they had engineered something behind the scenes. As more guests arrived, I found myself repeatedly scanning the stage. A microphone stood at the center, angled slightly downward, waiting. The podium beside it had a stack of cue cards. My father lingered near the stage too often for it to be coincidence. Ethan strutted around the room wearing a brand new designer watch that he had not paid for. His friends surrounded him, laughing at every joke he made, admiring him as if he were the sun around which they orbited. When he caught sight of me, he offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. Something in that expression felt practiced and artificial. I should have recognized it as a warning. As the ceremony began, I took my seat with other guests. I clapped politely as graduates walked across the stage. I tried to focus on the speakers and ignore the nagging sense of dread curling in the pit of my stomach. Every time my father shifted in his seat, I felt my shoulders stiffen. When Ethan's name was called, he stepped onto the stage with exaggerated excitement. My parents beamed as if they had produced a miracle. I clapped out of obligation rather than pride, but even that felt like an act of emotional labor I should not have been required to give. After the diplomas were distributed, the host announced that the reception portion of the evening would begin. Guests were invited to stand, mingle, and enjoy the catered dinner while a series of acknowledgments would be made. It was then that my father stood. He smoothed his jacket, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the stage with the deliberate posture of a man preparing for a performance. I felt my heartbeat quicken as he accepted the microphone. He cleared his throat. A hush fell over the crowd. My mother clasped her hands together with a proud smile. Ethan placed a hand on the back of his neck as if embarrassed, but his eyes glimmered with anticipation. My father thanked everyone for joining the celebration. His tone was warm and confident, his voice strong and steady. Then he spoke a sentence that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Tonight is not only about celebrating Ethan, but also about recognizing a bond between siblings. Harper has planned something very special. Murmurs rippled across the room. I felt my pulse throb at my temples. Before I could stand or interrupt, he continued with a booming voice, as if he were announcing a charity donation. Harper has decided to honor her brother with a brand new BMW M4, a $70,000 gift to show her love and pride for him. The room erupted. Applause exploded like fireworks. People cheered. Someone whistled. Phones rose into the air again. Cameras flashed from every direction. My breath caught. My hands trembled. A sensation like cold water poured down my spine. My father smiled broadly as if he had delivered the greatest gift on my behalf. Ethan pressed both hands to his chest with a dramatic gasp and mouthed the words, "I cannot believe it." My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The scene did not feel real. It felt staged and polished, carefully rehearsed by everyone but me. That was when I felt something shift inside me. Years of obedience. Years of silence. Years of being the responsible daughter who absorbed every bruise, every insult, every manipulation to avoid conflict. All of it cracked in that moment. I stood from my chair. The applause died down as people realized I had not reacted the way they expected. I walked toward the center of the room. My voice trembled only at the start. I never agreed to that. Those words sliced through the cheers like a blade. The crowd fell still. Someone lowered their phone. Someone muttered under their breath. A woman at a nearby table whispered that I must be joking. My father froze on stage. My mother stared at me as if I had slapped her. Ethan's fake expression dropped for a fraction of a second before he attempted to recover it. I repeated myself louder. I never agreed to buy a car. My father's jaw tightened and he gripped the microphone with white knuckles. He instructed me to stop making a scene. I told him calmly that he had made the scene the moment he used my name to lie to everyone. The crowd shifted with discomfort. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances. Others whispered judgment. One man muttered that I should not ruin the celebration. A woman near the front folded her arms and quietly said that family matters should stay private. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I did not back down. Over my father's shoulder, I saw Ethan watching with a cold, calculating expression. He was not embarrassed. He was annoyed that things were not unfolding the way he wanted. My father stepped off the stage and approached me with a rigid posture and blazing eyes. The room seemed to swell with tension. I braced myself but forced my shoulders to remain firm. My father hissed that I had humiliated the family. I replied that I would not pay for a fantasy he created. He told me to apologize. I refused. The room fell into a suffocating silence. That was the moment everything snapped. My father's face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Without warning, he struck me across the face. The impact echoed through the hall like a crack of thunder. Gasps shot up from every table. I stumbled backward, but before I could find my balance, he grabbed me by the arm and yanked me forward, shouting that I had embarrassed him for the last time. I could smell the sharp tang of wine on his breath. When I pulled away, he raised his fist again. I said no. My voice was softer than a whisper, yet somehow it reached him. It was the final spark. He threw the punch. Pain burst across the side of my head. The crowd erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped, glass shattered, people yelled. I hit the floor hard. I heard someone scream to call emergency services. Phones continued recording. Ethan did not move toward me. He simply stood there, watching, his face unreadable. The world around me blurred. The lights above swirled into a bright haze. That was the moment I realized exactly how far my family would go to protect their image. I lay on the ground, tasting blood and fear, feeling the cold floor beneath my cheek as voices swarmed around me. My father was pulled away. My mother cried out something I could not decipher. People shouted for help. My vision pulsed, and then a deep darkness began to pull me under. The moment my father's fist connected with my temple, the world shattered into noise and brightness and a ringing that felt like it was drilling into my skull. I did not fall immediately. My body hung in a strange, suspended state, confused and shocked, as if it could not compute that he had actually hit me with full force in front of a room full of witnesses. Then the ground rushed upward, and I dropped hard, my shoulder taking the first impact before my head struck the polished floor. A burst of white light shot across my vision. Someone screamed. Another person yelled to stop him. The music cut off mid-beat. I lay there stunned, tasting copper, my cheek pressed against the cold tile, the hum of the air conditioner suddenly deafening. My father was not finished. I felt a rough grip on my arm as he dragged me upward, my dress snagging on a chair leg, my head swimming. I tried to stand, but my knees wobbled like water. The room tilted. All I could see were blurred silhouettes and the faint glow of raised cell phones recording everything. My father's voice cut through the noise like a weapon. "You embarrassed me." The words were so full of venom that they felt like another blow. He tightened his grip on my arm and shook me. My vision snapped in and out. I told him to let go, but the words scraped out in a hoarse whisper only I seemed to hear. Ethan was standing a few feet away, doing nothing. His expression was detached, almost irritated, as though my suffering was an inconvenience in the middle of his party. I could not process how calmly he watched. I had grown up believing that siblings were supposed to protect each other, at least in moments when everything fell apart. Yet here he was, frozen like a statue carved out of selfishness. My father snarled something I could not understand and shoved me backward again. I hit the edge of a table and a stack of champagne flutes toppled to the ground, shattering around me. Glass skittered across the floor. Someone grabbed my father's shoulders, trying to pull him away, but he jerked free with a wild fury that made the entire room recoil. He shouted that no one should interfere and that this was a family matter. Those words brought back every memory of childhood moments swept quietly under the rug, the walls of silence, the excuses, the lies. My mother stepped forward with trembling hands, telling him to stop, but his rage drowned her out. For a second, his glare shifted toward her, and she shrank back as if she were the one who had been struck. I tried to crawl back, but the floor felt like it was tilting. My head throbbed in heavy pulses. The left side of my vision blurred and darkened. When I attempted to push myself up again, my palm slipped in spilled wine and my arm collapsed beneath me. My father lunged toward me. I felt his hand slam against my shoulder, forcing me down. The pain shot down my spine and stole my breath. I heard a woman screaming to call emergency services. Someone yelled to get security. Someone else shouted that he was going to kill me. The room was a storm of conflicting voices. My father seemed oblivious to them all. He knelt over me, his face twisted with a level of rage I had never seen before. Not anger, not frustration. Something deeper. Something unhinged. My heart pounded so violently that it felt like my ribs were shaking. He raised his fist again. I braced for impact, but a man rushed in from behind and grabbed my father's arm mid-air. They struggled his wild swing, shifting off course and hitting the floor beside my head with a sickening crack. A woman let out a gasp. Chairs scraped loudly as people backed away in fear. Another man joined the first, and together they managed to pull my father backward. Even then, he kicked out at them, shouting incoherently, demanding they let him go, insisting that I needed to learn a lesson. I lay there trembling, trying to breathe through the waves of pain spreading across my face and skull. My hearing faded in and out, warped and underwater. Someone knelt beside me and asked if I could hear them. I tried to answer, but my mouth felt numb. My tongue felt heavy. They touched my forehead gently, and their hand came away with blood. I watched the red smear on their fingertips in disbelief. I did not even remember when I had started bleeding. The bright overhead lights flickered in and out as the entire hall seemed to sway. The ringing in my ears grew louder. A security guard rushed in, followed by another. They restrained my father, who was still yelling that everything was my fault. I wanted to shrink into the floor. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the entire nightmare to stop. But the chaos only intensified. Someone shouted that an ambulance was on the way. Someone else yelled for ice. A group of guests crowded near the edge of the scene, but no one stepped closer. Everyone looked terrified. Some looked disgusted. A few looked conflicted, as if unsure whether to intervene or pretend they had seen nothing. I caught a glimpse of Ethan again. He was farther back now, standing beside a girl from his program. He had his arms crossed and a faint, annoyed expression, like a person forced to endure an interruption during an enjoyable conversation. He did not move toward me. He did not ask if I was hurt. He simply watched, detached, as if everything happening had nothing to do with him. My father continued cursing and thrashing until security pinned him to the ground. My mother stood off to the side, crying quietly into her hands, but I could not tell if she was crying for me or for the humiliation of the moment. My body shook uncontrollably as the sensation of cold crept up my arms. I tried to focus on breathing slowly, but my chest felt tight and constricted. Someone draped a jacket over my shoulders. Another person held my hand and told me help was almost here. The lights above flickered again, and for a moment, I feared I would pass out. When the paramedics finally arrived, the room parted instantly for them. They knelt around me with calm precision, lifting my head, slightly shining lights into my eyes, checking my pulse, asking me to follow a finger I could barely see. They asked me my name, the year, the city. I answered some of the questions. Others came out scrambled. They exchanged worried glances. They placed a collar around my neck to stabilize me and lifted me onto a stretcher. The movement made the room spin violently. As they wheeled me toward the exit, I heard someone say that the video was still streaming live. I heard another voice say that thousands of people were already watching. I saw flashes of phones. I saw people whispering to each other in disbelief. I saw Ethan looking away, uninterested. I saw my father pinned to the ground, still shouting. I saw my mother gripping her purse so hard her hands shook. The ceiling lights blurred into streaks as the paramedics pushed me through the doors. My head throbbed. My vision darkened again at the edges. The last thing I heard before everything faded was someone saying that I needed to stay awake. When I opened my eyes in the emergency room, everything looked wrong. The ceiling lights were harsh and cold and arranged in long rectangular patterns that made my vision blur every time I blinked. I could not tell how long I had been unconscious. My body felt heavy and numb, as if my bones had been replaced with stone. For several seconds, I did not know where I was or why a faint beeping sound echoed beside my head. Then a wave of pain rolled sharply through my skull and memory hit me with crushing force. The banquet hall, the punch, the screaming, my father's rage flashing across his face. I tried to sit up, but a firm hand pressed gently against my shoulder and told me to stay still. A nurse leaned over me, her expression steady and practiced, but I could see the concern in her eyes. She asked if I knew my name. I whispered Harper. She asked if I knew what happened. I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw like sandpaper had scraped against it. I told her I had been hit. She did not respond immediately. She only nodded as if she already knew. I realized then that there was dried blood on my neck. My hair felt stiff with it. The nurse shined a small light into my eyes and told me to follow it. The brightness stabbed at my vision, but I obeyed. She said I had a mild concussion and a laceration near my eyebrow that required sutures. She also mentioned bruising around my cheekbone and a significant spike in my blood pressure when I first arrived. Her voice was calm, but the words made my chest tighten. She told me the doctor would return shortly and that I should not move my head too quickly. She adjusted the blanket around me and then walked away with quiet footsteps. Once she left, I lay there staring at the opposite wall where a monitor displayed my heart rate. The green line flickered up and down steady but too fast. It looked like the heartbeat of someone who had been running for miles, not someone lying in a hospital bed. My head throbbed in rhythm with the beeping. I placed my hand over my forehead and winced when my fingers brushed against the tender swelling beneath the bandage. The room felt too bright, too cold, too exposed. Every thought in my mind was sharp and loud and jagged. I closed my eyes, but that only made the images return even clearer. My father's fist. My mother's horrified silence. Ethan watching with the bored disinterest of a spectator. The sound of glass shattering. The way the room fell into chaos like a crowd scattering after a gunshot. A wave of embarrassment surged through me. It felt like a physical blow. I had spent my entire life avoiding scenes like that. I had swallowed every insult for decades to maintain peace. I had folded myself into the smallest possible shape so no one would have access to the parts of me that hurt the most. Yet despite all the years I tried to make myself invisible, the worst moment of my life happened in front of hundreds of strangers. That thought alone was unbearable. Then my phone buzzed. The vibration against the metal railing made a clattering sound that tore me from my thoughts. I turned my head slowly, careful of the dizziness, and saw my phone on the small bedside table. The screen was lighting up again and again with messages coming in so fast that the notifications stacked on top of one another. I reached for the phone with a trembling hand. The moment I unlocked it, I froze. There were hundreds of missed calls, hundreds of text messages, dozens of news alerts, social media notifications spilling across the screen. My heart lurched. The top message was from a coworker. "Harper, are you all right? The video is everywhere." I scrolled down and my breath caught. There it was. A headline from a major news outlet. Father punches daughter during graduation celebration. Underneath it, another alert. Graphic video from Texas banquet hall goes viral. 12 million views in 24 hours. Below that, another. Hashtags trending nationwide. BMW beating, justice for Harper. I stared at the screen, unable to process the sheer volume of attention. My hands shook violently. I opened one of the links. A video began playing automatically. I saw myself falling backward after the punch. I saw the crowd recoiling. I saw people screaming. My stomach twisted with nausea. I closed the video immediately. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. I wanted to melt into the bed and disappear. But I could not tear my eyes away from the notifications. It felt like the entire world had rushed into my phone at once. People I had never met were sharing opinions about my life. Some were defending me. Others were asking how a father could do something like that. Others were attacking my family for trying to spin the story. And then I saw messages from my mother. Long, frantic paragraphs filled with excuses. "You made your father look like a monster. You should not have yelled at him. You know he only snapped because you embarrassed him. We need to talk before the media ruins our reputation." I felt heat rising inside my chest. Not anger, something deeper, something like grief mixed with clarity. My father had not created the narrative. My mother was already trying to rewrite it. She was not asking if I was alive or safe. She was asking why I had ruined the image of the family. I dropped the phone onto the bed and covered my face with both hands. Tears stung behind my eyelids, but I refused to cry. I had cried enough in my childhood to fill an ocean. I lay there breathing in slow, shallow breaths until I heard footsteps approaching. The doctor entered with the nurse from earlier. He asked how I was feeling. I told him my head hurt. He explained my test results, the concussion, the swelling, and the bruising. His voice was steady and respectful. When he finished, he gave me a long, concerned look and asked if I felt safe to return home with my family. I told him quietly that I did not. He nodded as if he expected that answer. He told me the hospital could connect me with a social worker if I needed support. I thanked him. When they left, I stared at the ceiling again. My phone buzzed once more. A message from someone I had not expected. It was from Dr. Lila Montgomery, the CEO of my company, Harper. I just saw the video. I am on my way. Those 7 words hit harder than any punch. My throat tightened. For the first time since I regained consciousness, I did not feel alone. I exhaled slowly, a long, trembling breath that carried a strange mixture of fear and relief. My life had just exploded across the internet. My family was already spinning lies. The public was demanding answers. But someone who mattered, someone who had always treated me with dignity, was coming. And for the first time in my life, I felt the faint pull of a shift. A turning point. A new beginning rising from a night of violence and shame. I was still lying in the emergency room staring at the ceiling when the door swung open with a sense of forceful purpose that immediately changed the air in the room. I did not have to lift my head to know who it was. Only one person walked like that, with heels that struck the floor in sharp, confident steps and a presence that made everyone else instinctively straighten. Dr. Lila Montgomery entered wearing a tailored ivory suit, her dark hair pulled back and her eyes focused with a kind of precision that could slice through chaos. She was the founder and chief executive of Skyreach Systems, my mentor. The woman who had quietly shaped my career from the day she noticed me presenting a structural analysis in a room full of men twice my age who barely looked in my direction. She stopped at the foot of my bed and surveyed me with an expression I had only seen a few times: protective, controlled, dangerous in its own quiet way. The nurse instinctively stepped aside as if making room for something larger than the hospital itself. For a moment, I could not speak. My throat burned, my vision blurred again, but this time I could not tell if it was the concussion or the sudden weight of relief spreading across my chest. Lila moved closer and rested a hand on the metal rail of the bed. She asked softly if I was in pain. Her voice was low, but carried an authority that wrapped itself around the room. I nodded. She asked if the doctors had explained my injuries. I nodded again. She studied the bandage near my eyebrow and the bruising along my cheekbone and inhaled slowly, the kind of inhale a person takes when they are holding back a fire. "Who did this to you?" Her words were not shouted, but they carried the weight of a courtroom verdict. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. "My father." For a moment, everything in the room stilled. Even the monitor seemed quieter. Lila closed her eyes for a brief second, the muscles in her jaw tightening. She opened them again, and her voice dropped to a tone I had only ever heard when she dismissed high-ranking contractors who tried to undermine her authority. "I saw the video." Her words sank into me with both shame and a strange sense of comfort. I tried to apologize, but she raised a hand before the word could form. "Do not apologize. You did nothing wrong." The way she said it made something inside me crack. A part of me that had been conditioned to accept blame for everything suddenly felt exposed under the light of her certainty. She pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down, crossing one leg over the other in a controlled movement that signaled she intended to stay. She told me she had already contacted hospital administration, spoken with security, and reviewed the footage. She said she knew my family had tried to contact her, but she had sent their calls directly to the legal department. Her eyes did not waver from mine. "You are not going back with them. They are not entering this hospital again." I stared at her, unable to form words. She continued, speaking each sentence measured and unshakable. "You have spent years letting them take pieces of you. I watched you work late at night. I watched you stay quiet when you deserved recognition. I watched you carry burdens that were not yours. But this ends tonight. Something warm and painful and overwhelming rushed through my chest. No one had ever stood up for me like this. No one had ever spoken about my life with such clarity. I felt tears gathering, but I blinked them back. The nurse returned briefly to check my vitals, but even she seemed affected by the presence in the room. She adjusted the monitor and left quickly, her expression soft with sympathy. Lila leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice. "You are under my protection now. Do you understand?" I nodded, hardly breathing. She asked if I felt safe. I admitted that I did not. She told me she had already arranged a private security escort stationed near the elevators. She had even contacted her driver, who was waiting outside. "You will not leave here alone." My breath shook. I had never felt small around Lila before, but now I felt both fragile and fortified, like I was being rebuilt molecule by molecule. She sat back and crossed her arms. Her eyes sharpened. "Your father will face consequences. Your mother as well. They chose violence and humiliation. We will choose truth and strategy." A chill ran through me. Not fear, recognition. This was the side of Lila that had built a multi-million-dollar aerospace firm from nothing. The side that had shut down unethical partnerships. The side that terrified board members who underestimated her. She was not merely an ally. She was a weapon. And now she was aiming that weapon on my behalf. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were printed screenshots from the video timelines of online shares and a list of media outlets that had contacted the company. She had sorted through it all before even stepping into my room. She placed the folder gently on my lap. "The world saw what he did, Harper. You will not carry this alone." My chest tightened again, and a tear finally slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. Lila reached out and brushed it away with the back of her hand. Her touch was gentle, but her expression was fierce. "Let yourself feel it. You survived something horrific. But you are not broken. Not even close." A quiet knock interrupted the moment. A hospital social worker peeked into the room and asked if now was a good time. Lila answered before I could. "Not yet." She closed the door firmly and turned back to me with a steady exhale. Then she did something I had not expected. She reached for my hand. It startled me. Lila was not a particularly affectionate woman. Her leadership style was built on confidence direction and an almost surgical emotional distance. But now, she held my hand with a quiet steadiness, as if grounding me in a moment when I felt like I was dissolving. She spoke softly. "I once made a promise to myself that if I ever met a young woman walking the tightrope between brilliance and burdens she never asked for, I would help her. I saw myself in you from the first day, and I am keeping my promise." My throat tightened so painfully I could barely breathe. She squeezed my hand once firm and resolute, and then released it. She stood and smoothed her suit jacket, transforming once again into the executive the world feared. She said she had already spoken to legal counsel who were reviewing options. Charges, restraining measures, civil action, corporate protection clauses, public statements. Everything was already in motion. I watched her move around the room with purpose. Every action she took seemed to stitch something inside me back into place. She paused near the window and looked out at the parking lot where camera crews had already begun gathering. Then she turned back to me with a measured expression. "They want a story. We will give them the truth, but on our terms, not theirs." I felt something unfamiliar rise within me, strength, a sense of being anchored. For the first time in my life, someone powerful was standing in front of me and saying that I mattered. She walked back to my bedside, rested her hand lightly on the rail, and said the words that permanently altered the trajectory of my life. "Harper, I am not letting you fall. Not this time. Not ever again." 2 days after the assault, I found myself standing beside Dr. Lila Montgomery outside a modest brick building in a quiet Texas neighborhood, the kind of place where people gathered for potlucks and choir practice and whispered gossip after Sunday service. The church parking lot was full, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the pavement, while groups of relatives shuffled inside in uneasy clusters. Somehow, my parents had managed to persuade the extended family to attend a meeting to correct the story circulating online, claiming the media had exaggerated and the video did not show the full truth. They intended to reclaim control of the narrative. They expected me to stay silent. But Lila had arrived in Texas with a plan. She walked beside me with steady confidence, projecting the calm authority of someone who had commanded rooms far more intimidating than a small church hall. Her eyes were sharp and unyielding, and she carried a leather case that held the projector files, statements, and printed digital evidence she had organized with surgical precision. I followed her through the doors, my heart pounding so hard I felt its vibration in my fingertips. The room buzzed with nervous chatter. Rows of folding chairs had been arranged in front of a small raised platform where a wooden lectern stood. My father occupied the center of the platform, wearing a forced, solemn expression that resembled a bad stage performance. My mother sat beside him, hands clasped on her lap, eyes red, but posture composed, as if preparing to deliver a eulogy. Ethan lounged against the edge of the stage, scrolling on his phone with the arrogance of someone who believed consequences were reserved for other people. The moment we stepped inside, all conversation dropped to a hush. Heads turned. Whispers passed from one relative to another. Some looked relieved to see me alive. Others looked irritated that I had shown up at all. Lila reached over and touched my elbow, gently grounding me. She guided me to the front row but did not sit. Instead, she moved toward the platform with purposeful steps. My father cleared his throat theatrically and began to speak in a rehearsed tone, thanking everyone for coming and insisting that recent events had been misunderstood. He claimed the video lacked context. He claimed emotions had been high and the clip did not show the full story. He claimed he had never intended harm. And then he delivered the line that made the room shift from uneasy sympathy to silent disbelief. Harper struck me first. The lie hung in the air like smoke. I felt the breath leave my lungs, but before I could respond, Lila stepped forward. She positioned herself between my father and the audience with the confidence of someone stepping into a courtroom she owned. Her voice carried across the room with cool clarity. "That is not true!" Everyone turned to look at her as if drawn into orbit. She stood with perfect posture, hands folded in front of her, expression unreadable. My father bristled and told her she was not part of the family. Lila replied that she was here as my employer and witness to the evidence. She opened her leather case and removed a small portable projector. She connected it to her phone with smooth, practiced movements. My father tried to protest, but she raised her voice just enough to cut through his attempt. The truth is not a matter of family hierarchy. It is a matter of documentation. The screen behind her lit up with a frozen image from the viral video. The room inhaled collectively. Even Ethan straightened. Lila pressed play. The footage began with the moment my father raised his fist. His expression contorted with rage. My body recoiling. The sound of the impact echoing across the banquet hall. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone covered their mouth. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else whispered that they had no idea it had been that violent. Lila let the video play in full. No edits, no commentary, just the raw truth. When it ended, the silence was so thick it felt like something solid. My father's face turned the color of wet clay. My mother looked down at her hands, trembling. Ethan glanced nervously toward the back of the room as if seeking an exit. Lila waited a beat before speaking. Harper was assaulted in front of hundreds of people, and the world saw it because it was recorded by multiple witnesses. She reached into her case again and pulled out printed screenshots of the tweets, the reposts, the slowed frame analysis, and statements from bystanders who had come forward. She handed copies to the relatives in the front row. They passed them back slowly, their faces morphing with each page. A murmur spread through the room, a shift of energy like the first gust of wind before a storm. Then Lila pulled out something my parents had never expected. Emails, printed emails. She held them up so the room could see. These, she said, are messages sent by Charles and Miriam Collins to extended relatives about a planned $70,000 gift. She read aloud the lines describing my alleged generosity, the fabricated claim that I had eagerly purchased a BMW. For Ethan, the pressure tactics disguised as celebratory announcements. People in the room stared at my parents with disbelief. An uncle asked slowly, So you lied about the gift. My father sputtered that it was a misunderstanding. My mother insisted she had simply assumed my intentions. Lila replied calmly, "You misrepresented her finances publicly and attempted to coerce her into paying for something she had refused multiple times." She placed the printed emails on the podium. Then she stepped aside, giving the room a clear view of my parents. No one spoke, not for a long moment. And then the anger began. A cousin stood first, pointing at my father and demanding to know how he could hit his own daughter. Another relative condemned my mother for allowing the situation to escalate. Someone in the back shouted that Ethan had stood there doing nothing while I was being attacked. Ethan muttered that he had been in shock, but no one believed him. The room became a whirlwind of outrage and shame. My father shouted at the relatives to stop judging him. They did not stop. My mother tried to defend herself, but the accusations drowned her out. I watched all of it with a surreal detachment. I felt like I was floating just outside my own body. For the first time in my life, the truth was standing in the center of a room, refusing to bow. And I did not have to defend myself. The evidence spoke for me. Lila stood a step behind me, her presence like an iron wall. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. She simply let the truth unravel every lie my parents had constructed. When the shouting died down, my aunt turned toward me with tears in her eyes and said she was sorry for not seeing it sooner. Another relative apologized for believing my parents without question. I felt my throat tighten, but I stayed silent. My father tried one last time to regain control, insisting that family unity mattered more than public humiliation. Lila responded for me. "Unity built on manipulation is not unity. It is captivity." Those words cut deeper than any the room had heard. My father fell silent. My mother dropped her gaze. Ethan looked at the floor. Lila gently placed a hand on my shoulder. It was not a dramatic gesture, but in that moment it felt like an anchor keeping me steady. She announced that legal action was forthcoming and that my safety and well-being were the priority. No one challenged her. No one defended my parents. No one denied the truth anymore. The room that had once echoed with applause for Ethan now echoed with the collapse of my family's carefully crafted image. As we walked toward the exit, the relatives parted for us, not out of formality, but out of respect. For me, for the evidence, for the truth, and for the woman who had made sure none of it stayed buried. In the days that followed the church confrontation, the world around me transformed with a speed and violence that felt almost unreal. Everything that had once been controlled by my parents, their reputation, their narrative, their authority, collapsed under the weight of the truth that had finally been dragged into the open. I remained in Texas under direct instruction from my doctor and from Lila, who refused to let me travel until my symptoms stabilized. The hotel suite she arranged was quiet and sunlit, with soft white bedding and blackout curtains that allowed me to rest without interruption. A private security team rotated outside the door in 12-hour shifts, making sure I slept without fear of someone pounding on the walls or demanding my compliance. It was the first time in my life I truly felt protected. Meanwhile, the consequences began to crash down on my parents like heavy waves. It started with the police. The morning after the church exposure, a detective arrived at my hotel to take a formal statement. His voice was professional, warm even, and he handled me with the kind of gentle patience that made the tremors in my hands gradually settle. He told me the video alone was enough to prompt an investigation into felony assault charges. He asked me to describe the events of the graduation ceremony, and though the memories were painful, spilling them into a recorded statement felt like reclaiming something long stolen from me. When the detective finished, he assured me the district attorney's office had already reviewed the footage and intended to pursue charges. The words washed over me like cold water. For years, my father's actions had been protected by silence, denial, and manipulation. Now the law had eyes on him. The next wave of consequence hit my father's business. While I rested in the hotel room, Lila kept me informed with updates she filtered carefully to avoid overwhelming me. She told me that several of his clients had terminated their contracts after seeing the viral footage. A manufacturing firm issued a public statement condemning violence and severed all ties with him effective immediately. Another corporation demanded a complete audit of his accounting records amidst rumors of financial misconduct. Within 72 hours, my father's company had lost almost all its major partnerships. Within a week, it was effectively gutted. I did not feel joy in the destruction, but I felt something deeper: justice. A slow, steady correction of a lifetime of imbalance. My mother faced consequences too, though they were of a different kind. Members of her church who had always praised her for her devotion and hospitality now viewed her with cold disapproval. They removed her from the Women's Leadership Committee and revoked her responsibilities for community events. Several longtime friends stopped responding to her messages entirely. It was not cruelty. It was accountability. She had known what my father was capable of, and she had protected him more fiercely than she had ever protected her own daughter. Now the community she once impressed wanted nothing to do with the lies she had upheld. Ethan was not spared either. The clip of him standing motionless during the attack had circulated almost as widely as the footage of the assault itself. Comment sections erupted with outrage, calling him heartless, selfish, and complicit. Job offers he had bragged about evaporated within days. A tech company withdrew their internship invitation, citing concerns about his character and suitability in team environments. His friends, who had once orbited him like he was a rising star, quietly distanced themselves. Even people who barely knew him online commented that his expression in the video showed a disturbing lack of empathy. For the first time in his life, Ethan was forced to face a world that did not treat him like a golden child. I did not celebrate his downfall, but I also did not shield him from the truth. He had stood by and watched violence unfold without lifting a hand. He had made his choice, and now the world was responding. The civil case came next. Lila arranged a meeting with her legal team, who spoke to me with a level of respect and seriousness I was not used to receiving. They explained the options for filing a lawsuit against my father and mother for assault, emotional distress, and financial coercion. They reviewed the evidence in detail: the video, the emails, the hospital records, the witness statements. Every piece of documentation fit together like a puzzle, forming a picture impossible to deny. After hours of discussion, I agreed to proceed. It was not revenge. It was restoration. A reclaiming of the years during which I had been told that my pain was insignificant while others demanded everything from me. When the lawsuit was filed publicly, the media erupted again. Headlines spread across major networks. Commentators debated the family dynamics and the societal implications. Advocates for survivors of family violence praised the decision to pursue legal action. Strangers online posted messages of support. Some shared their own stories. Their words made my chest ache with a bittersweet mix of sorrow and solidarity. A court date was scheduled for 2 months later. My father's attorney attempted to negotiate a quiet settlement, but my legal team refused. Lila refused, and deep down I refused as well. The truth deserved daylight, not secrecy, not handshake agreements behind closed doors. When the hearing finally came, the courtroom was cold and sterile, with pale walls and tall windows that let in too much light. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside my attorney, feeling the familiar tremor of anxiety, but also a stronger feeling beneath it: resolve. My father entered wearing a suit that hung awkwardly on his shoulders, as if he had aged years in only weeks. My mother followed closely behind him, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. Ethan walked in last, avoiding my gaze entirely. When my father saw me, his expression wavered, not from remorse, but from disbelief that I had dared to stand against him. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully. The video played once more, but this time in a room where truth was not debated but measured. The sound of the impact echoed in the courtroom, and the judge's expression hardened. My attorney presented the printed emails and the testimony from relatives who had been deceived. A medical expert verified the extent of my injuries. A forensic specialist confirmed the timestamps and authenticity of the footage. My father's attorney tried to argue provocation, but the judge stopped him with a stern warning, citing the clarity of the evidence. After several hours of arguments, statements, and witness examinations, the judge delivered the ruling with steady authority. My father was found liable for assault and intentional infliction of emotional distress. A restraining order was issued barring him and my mother from contacting me for 2 years. Financial damages were awarded to cover medical costs, lost wages, therapy expenses, and punitive measures for the coercion and deception that had been proven. As the judge spoke, I felt something inside me loosen. Not relief, not victory. Something quieter. Something long overdue. Freedom. My father's shoulders slumped as if the weight of consequences had finally settled upon him. My mother covered her mouth, but I saw no tears, only fear of what others would think. Ethan stared at the table, refusing to look at me. When it was over, I walked out of the courtroom with slow, deliberate steps. The sunlight outside felt different, warmer somehow. Lila waited near the entrance, and when she saw me, she nodded once, the simple, proud gesture of someone who had watched me rise from the heaviest shadows of my life. "You did it," she said. And for the first time, I believed her. The past had finally stopped chasing me. The justice I had been denied for decades had found its way to me at last. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the echoes of the gavel faded into silence, I walked into the Texas sunlight feeling both weightless and strange, as if my body no longer remembered how to carry itself without fear pressing down on my spine. For the first time in decades, no one was tugging at my wallet, my time, my dignity, or my sense of belonging. No one was telling me to sacrifice my needs so someone else could shine. The world around me seemed sharper, the air cleaner, the sky a deeper blue than I had allowed myself to notice since childhood. A chapter had ended, but what came next was mine to build. Lila insisted I return to Denver to recover, so she booked a private flight through her company, insisting the concussion made commercial travel too risky. I sat by the window with my head resting gently against the padded seat, watching the clouds drift like pale islands across the sky. My phone buzzed endlessly with messages from coworkers, friends, and strangers. Some wrote that they had been following the case from the beginning. Others shared their own stories of family pressure or hidden abuse. Many simply wrote, "I am proud of you." For a long time, I stared at those messages, unsure how to absorb the idea that people could admire me without demanding something in return. When I landed in Denver, my apartment felt different than when I had left it for Ethan's graduation. It felt like a home built by my own hands rather than a place I hid from the expectations of others. I walked from room to room, touching familiar surfaces, letting the quiet settle into my bones. The hum of the fridge, the softness of the couch, the smell of lavender detergent stirred a sense of ownership I had never felt before. I was alone, but for the first time, the word felt full rather than empty. The next morning, I returned to work. Colleagues welcomed me with warm smiles and gentle hugs, careful not to jostle my healing injuries. Some had followed the trial closely. Others had seen the viral videos. No one treated me like a spectacle. They treated me like a colleague who had survived something terrible and still shown up ready to move forward. Lila met me in her office, her elegant hands resting on a stack of documents. She wore a soft expression, the kind that acknowledged both triumph and tenderness. "Sit," she said, and when I did, she pushed a folder toward me. Inside was a promotion letter offering the role of Director of Structural Systems, a position I had never dared to imagine. As I scanned the document, my vision blurred. I had endured so much belittlement at home that even now, part of me struggled to believe I was worthy of leadership. "You have earned every word," Lila said. "Not because of what happened in Texas, but because of every project you have led, every crisis you have solved, every idea you have brought to life. Do not let them define you. Let this define you." I signed the letter with a hand that trembled from gratitude rather than fear. The promotion brought a salary that exceeded anything my parents had ever dreamed of. Yet the real reward was the validation that my work mattered, that I mattered. With that stability came a desire to build something that reached beyond myself. I spent nights drafting the foundation document for a new charitable program, one dedicated to supporting women who faced financial coercion, emotional exploitation, or family-driven manipulation. I named it the No Is Not Violence Foundation. The name reflected the truth I had learned after a lifetime of being told that refusal was selfish. I wanted others to know that saying no was not an act of cruelty, but an act of survival. Within weeks, donations poured in from supporters across the country. Women wrote letters saying they wished something like this had existed years ago. Therapists wrote offering pro bono services. Universities invited me to speak. I accepted only a few engagements, choosing instead to build the foundation slowly, carefully, ensuring it would provide long-term support to those who needed it most. Meanwhile, I began the quiet work of healing. Therapy became a steady rhythm in my weeks. My therapist helped me unearth the layers of conditioning that had kept me trapped for so long. We spoke about childhood memories I had pushed aside and the financial exploitation I had normalized. We talked about the emptiness I had felt every time my success was ignored and the shame I carried for daring to want more. Healing was not a straight path. Some days I woke up trembling from nightmares of my father's fist. Other days I walked through the office feeling powerful and unbreakable. Emotional undulation, my therapist called it, the rise and fall of recovery, the heart rebuilding itself in waves. In time, I stopped jumping at loud noises. I stopped checking the peephole twice before opening the door. I stopped expecting every phone call to bring disaster. Slowly, I allowed myself to breathe. I allowed myself to trust. I allowed myself to exist without apology. Months passed and the scars on my forehead softened into faint pale lines. I traced them in the mirror one morning, and instead of remembering the moment of violence, I remembered the moment of refusal, the moment I had said no before an entire room full of people. I had been terrified, but I had stood my ground. Those scars became symbols of that strength. Not disfigurement, not shame. Evidence of survival, evidence of awakening. As life settled into a new pattern, I made choices that felt small but profound. I stopped sending money to anyone who demanded it. I blocked numbers that dragged me into old cycles. I decorated my apartment with warm gold lights, soft blankets, and plants that thrived beneath my care. I cooked meals for myself instead of eating on the go. I reclaimed Friday nights as evenings to rest rather than nights spent solving someone else's crisis. I took long walks around the city, breathing in the Colorado air that carried the scent of pine and the promise of freedom. Slowly, a community began to form around me. Friends invited me to their homes for dinner. Coworkers included me in their celebrations. Neighbors waved when I passed by. These connections were not born from obligation, but from mutual respect, from genuine affection, from the understanding that chosen family can be more real than anything stitched by blood. One evening, Lila visited my apartment bringing a bottle of sparkling cider and 2 crystal glasses. We talked about drone stabilizers and future contracts and the foundation. Then we sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. "You know," she said, "you are living a life you built with your own hands. Do not let anyone take that from you." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle warmly into my chest. I had emerged from darkness, not unscarred, but unbroken. And now my story belonged to me. To close this chapter, I wanted to speak directly to those who had followed my journey from afar. So I recorded a message for the Foundation's channel filmed softly in my living room with evening light streaming behind me. I spoke honestly about boundaries, dignity, and survival. I said, if you believe boundaries matter, type justice in the comments. I said, tell me where you are watching from, because I want to know how far these stories reach. I asked, has anyone ever tried to control you with guilt? I promised them they were not alone. I promised them healing was possible. As I ended the recording, I realized something powerful. I had spent years believing my worth was measured by what I gave away. Now I understood my worth was measured by what I protected, my peace, my dignity, my future. I chose myself, and I would keep choosing myself every day that followed. If you stayed with me until this moment, then I want to speak to you directly, because stories like this do not just entertain. They reveal the parts of our culture we are still afraid to name, and sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is look at suffering without turning away. Maybe you watched what happened to Harper and felt something twist in your chest because you have lived through a version of this pain yourself. The silence at family tables, the expectations that drain you, the apologies you were trained to make even when you did nothing wrong. Maybe you saw the moment she said no and paid for it in blood, and you remembered the day you tried to stand up for yourself and someone told you that you were selfish or dramatic or ungrateful. These wounds are not small, they shape who we become, and for many of us, they follow us into adulthood like shadows that never learned how to leave. I want you to know that you are not alone in that experience. Thousands of people will watch this story and recognize pieces of themselves inside Harper's journey. They will see the quiet child who worked twice as hard for half the love, the teenager who was used, the adult who had to rebuild from the ashes of someone else's entitlement. And if you felt that recognition, I want you to take a moment and write your voice into the world, because healing begins with speaking the truth out loud. Tell me where you are watching from, because every pin on the map reminds us that pain like this is universal and that strength can grow anywhere. If you have ever had your boundaries dismissed, if someone has ever made you feel like your only value was what you could provide, if you have ever been punished for saying no, I want to hear your story. You might be surprised how many people read your comment and say, I thought I was the only one. That is the beauty of community. It breaks the spell that isolation casts. And if you believe that no one owes their life to people who harm them, then type justice in the comments, because that word is more than a slogan. It is a declaration that dignity matters. Harper stood up for herself in the only way she could in that moment, and the cost was severe. But look at what came after. She built her own foundation, her own life, her own sense of worth separate from the people who taught her to shrink. That is the part of the story I want you to hold on to. The punch did not define her. Her refusal did. Maybe today you are standing at the edge of your own boundary, wondering if it is worth the fight, if speaking up is worth the fallout, if walking away means losing people you once thought you needed. Let this story remind you that your worth does not come from what you endure, but from what you protect. Your peace, your voice, your future. If you are rebuilding your life brick by brick after years of being overlooked, then write one thing you are proud of today, no matter how small. It might be that you woke up without fear. It might be that you said no to something that drained you. It might be that you finally told the truth, even if your voice shook. And if someone in the comments shares something brave, respond to them. Remind them they are not alone. That is how community grows, one voice encouraging another. Before you go, take a breath and recognize the courage it takes to confront stories like this. And remember, you deserve respect, you deserve safety, you deserve a life not defined by anyone else's entitlement. If you believe that, type justice and let the world know that your boundaries are not up for negotiation.